2008, I went from birth to death. That is, I switched from being an obstetrical nurse to a hospice nurse. I felt like childbirth had become this scheduled procedure where most of the women were getting their labors induced or having C-sections, and all the women were attached to fetal monitors where we could watch from the nurse's station, and we didn't even have to be in their rooms a lot of the time. And I just missed the old-fashioned hands-on nursing I used to do. So I traded in that high-tech world for the low-tech, high-touch world of caring for people who chose to die at home. I pictured myself sitting on their beds, holding their hands and saying, "Go to the light." But there wasn't a lot of time to sit on their beds. Once I got started, I was running around trying to meet their needs and the needs of their families. And there were plenty of days when I questioned my decision to leave my old job. Because, see, in the hospital, I had a whole team of doctors and nurses that worked with me, and they were also my friends. But in hospice, every day I went out alone to see these patients in their homes. And in the hospital, I was in charge. I was the caregiver, and the family members were, the visitors. But then in hospice, the family members were the primary caregivers, and I was now the visitor that had to earn their trust. And in the hospital, I took care of mostly young, healthy women for just a few hours. And in hospice, I took care of people, really sick people, for months on end. And I started waking up in the middle of the night, worrying about them, and thinking about them on my days off. And it took me a long time to find that balance of being fully present for these folks when I was working and allowing another nurse to take charge when I wasn't. But I met so many interesting people in that job. I never knew there were so many interesting people until I started stepping into their homes and then stepping into their lives. My favorite patient was this man named Robert, who was self-educated, but he was so smart and interesting and knew a lot about so many things. And he called me his Valkyrie, which he explained was a mythological female figure who chooses a warrior from the battlefield and then brings him to the afterlife. Pretty intense, huh? It was intense and it was sad, but I saw a lot of love in those families, and there was plenty of humor too. I remember one time going to visit a patient of mine who was getting obviously sicker and weaker, and he had been a college professor, so he spoke kind of formally at times. And that day he said to me, "Cindy, when do you think I will expire?" And I said, I'm not sure, Joe, but I think you're getting closer. And he smiled at me and said, "So are you." And his sister was sitting there, so she thought, oh, we're talking about death. I'll say, "Joe, do you have any regrets?" He said, "Yes. I should have drank more champagne." And then another time I had to break it to a man that his wife was actively dying. So he got a little tearful, and then he leaned over this poor woman who was barely conscious, and he said, "Did you hear that, honey? You're not going to have to floss anymore." But it was weird because in my old job, people would say, "Oh, that seems like such a fun place to work." But as a hospice nurse, all I ever heard was, "How can you do that job?" And hospice gets a bad rap. I mean, so much so that I had some family members telling me I couldn't even say the word hospice in front of the patient. And I think, well, who am I supposed to be, the Avon lady or the meter reader? And the thing is, hospice really is a good word because it dates all the way back to the Middle Ages. And at that time, it referred to a place of shelter for sick or weary travelers who were on a long journey. And at the hospice, these travelers could find rest and comfort. And as modern hospice workers, we were still there just to offer comfort to patients and families who were on this very difficult journey together. And so I'd say probably after a year or so, I had no regrets about leaving my old job because in hospice, I had the honor of being a witness to the strength that people can find within themselves when faced with the loss of somebody they love, and a witness to the amount of compassion and caring that people can show for one another. It occurred to me one day that a dying person has something in common with a baby being born. Both of them are leaving a familiar place and going into the unknown. And as both a labor and delivery nurse and a hospice nurse, part of my work was helping to provide safe passage. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Great job.